They painted a cross on my door, whispering that my end was near, as if I were already a corpse laid out beneath their tongues, as if the house itself had become a coffin. I did not cry out. I did not run. I did not even call the police. I fetched a bucket of water and an old sponge, the kind that had cleaned my kitchen counters for years, and I pressed it against the cold wood until the white streaks began to dissolve into pale rivers. From the corner of my eye, I could see the curtains in the houses across the street tremble slightly, the way they always do when people pretend not to watch. They wanted to see whether I would kneel down and scrub like a punished child, whether I would hang my head in shame, whether I would let the marks sink into me. But I looked directly back at them, not with anger, not even with defiance, but with the flat stare of a woman who has been through too much to tremble anymore. They wanted a spectacle, a humiliation, a confirmation of my weakness, but all they got was the steady sound of water dripping on old wood, my shoulders bent not in defeat, but in slow insistence. I wiped until my fingers ached, until my knuckles were raw from pressing too hard, until the line of the cross blurred into nothing but wet grain. The sun was going down, the light was low and cruel, and still I scrubbed. And when I finally stepped back, the door looked almost new, though my hands bore the sting of rough sponge and cold water. The neighbors saw all of it, every motion, every pause, and when I finished, they closed their curtains and turned on their lamps as though the evening had returned to normal. But of course it had not, because now I knew that they wanted me gone. I am 82 years old, and I live alone in this narrow house on the edge of the town, where the bus passes only twice a day, and the pavement cracks like tired skin. People sometimes say that solitude is a choice, that if you are lonely, you must simply step outside and speak. But they forget how quickly a woman like me can become invisible. Once I was not alone. I had a husband who left behind a silence larger than the house itself, and I had a daughter who calls rarely and speaks as if my words are interruptions rather than conversation. And I had neighbors who once came for sugar and tea, who once asked for help with their children, who once smiled at me in the grocery store. Now I am tolerated rather than welcomed. I have become a reminder of fragility, of the body's betrayal, of time's cruelty, and no one wants to hold that reminder too long in their hands. When I walk to the corner shop, people smile too brightly, their eyes sliding away as if to reassure themselves that they will not end as I have ended. They see the slow steps, the white hair, the tired cardigan, and they think, that is not me, not yet. And so they hurry on. The house, though old, is solid, and I have kept it in order as best I can. I wash the curtains twice a year. I polish the floorboards that creak beneath my weight. I tend to the small garden that produces a few stubborn roses each summer. I keep a kettle on the stove that whistles even when no one is coming to drink with me. I still set the table for two sometimes, out of habit more than hope, and I leave a chair near the window clear as though someone might arrive. But the truth is that no one comes, and the silence stretches across the rooms like a second wallpaper, one that no sponge can erase. The silence itself is heavy, but heavier still is the gaze of those who surround me, the ones who painted the cross. They no longer speak directly. They whisper instead, outside my window, in the hallway of the church, at the pharmacy. I hear pieces. She should be moved. It's not safe. Someone ought to do something. Their words fall like small stones against glass, never enough to shatter, always enough to rattle. I did not always live under suspicion. Once I was the one people turned to, the one who baked bread for the neighborhood children, who stitched curtains for the newlyweds, who sat at the bedside of the sick. When my husband was alive, we were hosts of barbecues, birthdays, ordinary evenings filled with laughter. I carried casseroles across this very street, and others carried back their gratitude. But gratitude is a short-lived currency. It does not build interest. It does not secure loyalty. It evaporates the moment you become less useful. I should not be surprised that they forget the nights I stayed with their crying babies, the mornings I lent them a ride, the years I paid taxes that kept their schools open. People remember favors only as long as they might be repeated. Once they sense the well is drying, they walk away, or worse, they circle like birds waiting for the last movement of breath. The cross was not just paint. It was a message. They wanted me to understand that my presence here is inconvenient, that the property would be better in someone else's hands, that an old woman alone has no claim to space when younger families hunger for square footage. They disguise their hunger as concern, speaking of my safety, my vulnerability, my supposed decline, but I hear the calculation in their voices. A house without heirs is a prize. A widow with shaking hands is a target. And so the whispers grow and the marks appear, and soon enough, even the air around me feels owned by someone else. Still, when I washed that cross away, I felt something that startled me. Not despair, not terror, but a strange pulse of strength. My body is not quick, my breath is sometimes short, but my will remains. I wanted them to see that I would not let their symbol linger, that I would not walk each day through a doorway marked for death. They wanted to make me invisible by declaring me finished, and I answered by insisting on being present. The water splashed onto my shoes, my skirt grew damp, but the lines faded, and I thought to myself, if they want me gone, they will have to do more than paint. I live in this house still, surrounded by those who prefer me silent. But I am not silent tonight. I remember the sting of that sponge, the watching eyes, the trembling curtains, and I know that the story begins there, with the mark that was meant to erase me, and the decision to erase it instead. Perhaps to them I am already a shadow, but inside I am still a woman who sees, who remembers, who refuses to vanish simply because others have grown impatient. That cross was supposed to be the end, but for me, it was the beginning of something else, though at the time I did not yet know what shape it would take. All I knew was this: they painted death on my door, and I, with aching hands, washed it off. The morning after the cross, when the wood of the door was still damp where the paint had sunk into the grain, I opened the curtains and found the street, pretending to stretch and yawn as if nothing had happened, as if night had not laid its chalky fingers on my house. And I stood there for a long breath, longer than the kettle needs to warm, and I watched the thin plume of fog that always rises from the gutter at dawn. And I told myself that if I moved slowly enough, I might slip back into the life I had yesterday, the one with its small rituals and its quiet corners. Yet the day had other plans, because at my feet, wedged beneath the mat, lay a flyer from a funeral home I had never heard of, folded once and creased as if handled by someone who preferred not to touch it too long. And in tidy blue ink, it said my name, and beneath it, the words "Pre-need consultation confirmed," which is a phrase that tastes like dust when you say it, a sentence that pretends to be kind while measuring your absence. And for a moment, I thought it must be a mistake, a clerical error, the wrong door, until I turned it over and saw the appointment time. Thursday at 2. The address 3 blocks from the church, and the note at the bottom. We look forward to helping your family plan a peaceful transition. And then I understood that someone had already begun making arrangements for a departure I had not agreed to take. I went to church to ask the priest for the spare keys to the parish hall, because mine was bent, and I sometimes use the large sink there to scrub the heavy pots I cannot manage in my small kitchen. And Father O'Connell met me half the way down the aisle with the expression people put on when a dog has wandered into a garden that's not his, that mixture of pity and irritation, and he took my hands in both of his and said that he had heard. That word travels fast in a town so eager to serve its stories hot, and he asked if I had brought paperwork for last rites, as if I were expected to keep a folder for dying the way others keep one for taxes. And he spoke gently about comfort and acceptance and the body's return to rest. And I listened, with the patience of a woman who knows that arguing with tenderness is another kind of humiliation, and I told him I was here for the keys, not for the door that opens only once, and I watched surprise rearrange his face. And he said of course, and fetched them quickly, and he promised to check on me soon, as if checking were the same as seeing, and on my way out the sacristy clerk pressed a palmful of pamphlets into my bag, Grief and Preparation, and the right hymns, and I carried them home. Because sometimes it is easier to carry the weight you did not ask for than to explain why you will not. By midday, I decided to walk to the pharmacy, not for drama or for proof, but because the pills that keep my heart from knocking too insistently were low, and the small order of movement the errand requires often steadies me, and the air had that late morning flatness that makes everything feel slightly performed. And at Hollis Pharmacy the bell above the door gave its tired ring, and the girl with the glittered nails smiled too brightly and disappeared to fetch the bottle. And then she returned with her smile rearranged into bureaucratic apology and asked me to wait for Mr. Hollis, who came from the back with the gravity of a man who has chosen a profession that is mostly counting and carefulness. And he asked me to sit, and he lowered his voice, and he told me that my account had been flagged for transfer to a facility named Glen Oaks Residence, effective next month, and that my prescriptions were scheduled to be managed by their in-house doctor, which is a phrase that sits on the tongue like cold fat. And I said, there must be a mistake, because I have not transferred anywhere except from my kitchen chair to my garden bench. And he turned his screen slightly and showed me the line with my name and the notation that a primary contact had authorized the change, and the name on that line was my daughter's, Ruth's, spelled right and neat, and below it a number I recognized. And for a second, I thought of all the afternoons I had watched Ruth play in the cracked parking lot, behind our old building when she was small, her knees scabbed, her hair in crooked braids, her socks never matching, and I tried to fit that child into the shape of this line of text that removes a woman from her own life with a single call. I walked home slower than I usually do, not because my body failed me, but because I needed the time to braid the facts into something I could hold without dropping. And on my gate there was another paper, this one official in its tone and blank in its heart. A notice from the Meadow Lane Improvement Council, which is not a council but a handful of neighbors who meet in each other's kitchens and pronounce themselves a force. And the paper said there had been reports of declining capacity and possible safety concerns, and they would therefore be conducting a wellness assessment next Tuesday at 10. And if I did not consent, they would request a police escort. And I stood there with the paper in my hand and thought about how quickly care turns into custody when people decide you are inconvenient, and I pictured their faces. Mrs. Penfield with her pearl studs and her mouth like a zipper, and the young couple in the gray house who speak as if their opinions were government-issued. And I saw them around a table with their tea and their certainty, writing my future in blunt pencil. And I felt the old anger from when I was young rise like heat from a stove no one has turned off. On the kitchen table, the funeral pamphlets looked at me with their tastefully muted lilies and their promises of serenity. And beside them, I placed the pharmacy receipt with its new address I had not chosen, and the notice about the assessment. And I thought of my husband, who once said that bureaucracy is just bullying in a clean shirt. And I filled the kettle because a person should drink when the body feels the tremor of wrongness. And while it sang, I telephoned my daughter, and she answered, on the second ring with that voice of hers that is both brisk and far away, the voice you use when you already know the end of the story. And before I could finish my first sentence, she said she had been meaning to call, and that everyone was worried, and that Mrs. Penfield had reached out to her because, Mom, the neighborhood is concerned about your safety. And she used the plural the way people do when they want to hide their own face inside a crowd. And I told her about the pharmacy and the funeral appointment and the assessment. And she sighed in a way that means she believes herself the only adult in the room. And she said I was making this difficult, and that at my age, decisions are a community effort, and that she had looked at Glen Oaks, and it was sweet and clean and close to a park, and there would be people to talk to, and I said I have people to talk to, the kettle and the roses and the sparrows and the memory of your father. And she said she was being practical, and I said she was being efficient, and she said those were the same thing, and I said they had never been, not in a home, not in a family, not in a life. And she went quiet in that way she has, when she is pretending to consider another's point of view while waiting for it to stop speaking. When she finally talked again, she used the lawyer words, the ones bought in bulk at the office where she works, and she spoke about power of attorney and medical proxies, and how it would be easier for everyone if papers were in order before a crisis. And I asked her which crisis we were preparing for, and she said, the one we all know is coming. And I asked her when exactly we began to call a mother's breath a crisis. And she said I was being dramatic, and I told her that no, the drama is outside. My door, painted in a single violent gesture that pretends to be a symbol, when it is only a threat, and she said the cross was childish and not to give it power. And I said, papers give it power. Transfers give it power. The police at my stoop with their polite knocks give it power. And she said I was safe if I cooperated. And I said safety that requires surrender is not a safety I recognize. And there was a rustle on her end, as if she had stood up, as if she needed to move the way people do when they cannot bear to stay inside a decision. And then she said that she had already placed a small deposit to hold my room, and I remember that I sat down not because I felt faint, but because I felt the floor tilt, the way it does in old houses, when you discover a beam has been gnawed thin by time. After the call, I did what my mother taught me to do when a world suddenly tries to rearrange around you. I washed my face, I spread a clean cloth, I sorted the papers into the piles of what can be refused and what must be confronted, and I opened the doctor and walked out to the stoop. And the light had that late afternoon gold that makes even ugly things briefly tender. And across the way, I saw Mrs. Penfield pretend to water a plant that does not need water, and I thanked her loudly for her concern, so that the words drifted like a small parade down the sidewalk, and I saw her flinch, and I knew that the game had changed, because the catalyst is not always a blow. Sometimes it is the sound of your own voice not asking permission to exist. Inside, the kettle, which had cooled and forgotten its earlier singing, waited to be warmed again, and the cross, which had tried to declare the end of my story, had instead performed the courtesy of underlining the first sentence of a new chapter. And though I had not yet chosen what to do, the choice had moved from their table back to mine. And that is how an old woman begins to become dangerous in a town that prefers her obedient and nearly gone. The days that followed did not arrive like storms with sirens and shattered branches, but rather like a steady, deliberate fog that seeped through the seams of the house and made every surface slightly damp with implication. And I understood that this was how it would be done, not with a single knock that could be refused, or a single paper that could be torn in half, but with a sequence of small, apparently reasonable gestures, each one barely weighty enough to complain about. All of them together, like stones carried secretly in the hem of a skirt, until the fabric drags in the dust and you cannot lift it without help. And the first stone was the newspaper, which simply did not arrive on Monday. And when I telephoned the circulation desk, the young man told me with the efficiently cheerful voice of someone reading from a screen that the delivery had been suspended per family request during convalescence. A word that made me picture my body lying in its own living room, covered by a thin hospital blanket. And when I informed him that I was neither family nor convalescing, he laughed politely and said he could restart it if I wished, though it would take a week, and in that week, the grocery delivery I sometimes allowed myself for the heavier items arrived without the bleach I had ordered, because according to the note tucked into the box, the driver had been advised that toxic chemicals were unsafe for clients in decline, which is a phrase that squeezes the throat without using hands, and my bin, which I always wheel to the curb on Tuesday nights, with the same careful pride I once reserved for setting a formal table, was gently dragged 6 houses down and left behind a hedge as if it had lost its way, and on the lid someone had written, "Watch your step," in dry erase marker. And I stood in the twilight with the empty bin and the words ghosting the plastic, and thought of how cruelty has learned to dress itself in caution. By Wednesday, the mail began to arrive resealed with the kind of translucent tape that claims it was always there. And among the envelopes was a glossy trifold from a company called Dignity Transitions that offered compassionate estate, simplification, and the brochure had photographs of smiling daughters touching their mothers' shoulders as if guiding them gently to the exit of a museum. And tucked into it was a handwritten card, welcoming me to their complimentary seminar at the library, the date already circled in silver pen. And when I went to the library to return a novel, the clerk whispered that she had seen my name on the prayer list, printed in the church bulletin as failing but faithful, which might have made me smile if it had not been followed by the librarian from the children's room putting her palm on my arm and asking if I wanted to donate beloved volumes for the hospice cart. And outside on the square, I saw a chalkboard by the cafe advertising a neighborhood meal train for our dear elder during her transition, with a sign-up sheet that already bore 4 names and 3 casseroles. And I stood there, imagining the parade of lukewarm charity that would knock at my door with disposable pans, and the bright faces of people who do not want to stay long enough to hear a story. And I understood that to refuse their dishes would be to brand myself ungrateful, and to accept them would be to agree that I was already somewhere near the threshold. And so I walked past without erasing the heart someone had drawn beside my street number. The wellness assessment letter had said Tuesday at 10, and by Friday, a second notice appeared repeating the time and adding a line about how non-compliance might necessitate support, and the word support, which once meant the hinge beneath a P shelf or the good friend who shows up with soup after a funeral, had acquired a new weight that sounded like boots and appointments and forms. And on Saturday, I saw two men with clipboards stop at my gate and measure the height of the hedge with the same air of civic righteousness someone might bring to inspecting a dam, and a bright orange warning appeared on the lamppost, announcing that parking on my side of the street would be restricted pending safety review. And though no one roams our block after dark except two cats and the insomnia that keeps them moving, the new sign made my house look like a place where something dangerous might spill at any moment. And when I went to church on Sunday and slipped into the last pew, the usher greeted me with a softness that was almost choreographic and asked whether I had any final hymns, as if a woman were a service to be scheduled instead of a life to be consulted. And Father O'Connell's sermon spoke in roundabout ways about Abraham's willingness to go where he was sent. And when our eyes met at the door, he reminded me that surrender could be holy. And I nodded, because a threshold of holiness is not a place to argue. But on the inside, I answered him with every ordinary stubborn thing I owned. The pans scrubbed thin, the threadbare towel that still dries the dishes, the iron roses that unfold every June from the heat of the sidewalk. Ruth telephoned again, and this time her voice had the brightness of someone who has finished a terrible task and expects congratulations for the courage of it, and she told me that the facility, how I dislike that word, which should describe a capacity to do something and instead describes a place to stop doing everything, had a room with a window that faced east, and there would be morning light for my plants if I wished to bring them, and I said, the plants wish to remain where they have. Learned the sun, and she moved on quickly to the matter of papers, which had arrived by certified mail in a large envelope that wanted my life to be simplified into boxes that could be checked by strangers. And there was a form that called itself a consent to share information with designated stakeholders. A phrase I read 3 times because I could not imagine that my pulse and my pantry and my lock and my lamp now belonged to a category better suited to a boardroom. And there was also a copy of a power of attorney marked draft for signature. And when I pointed out the indecency of drafting a signature before asking a question, she said it was merely preparation. And I told her that mothers are not earthquakes that require go bags. And she replied that I was being uncooperative, and I said that cooperation required a cause and not just a chorus. And she said that Mrs. Penfield had been very helpful, and my jaw ached with the effort not to laugh, because if virtue had an opposite that wore pearls and wrote minutes, it would be that woman. And when Ruth mentioned that the pharmacy would no longer fill certain prescriptions, unless a facility physician assumed oversight, I understood that the circle was closing, that even the bottle with my name would be counted not as proof of me, but as permission to move me like a piece of furniture. Small things began to loosen their loyalty, the world withdrawing its everyday courtesies as if to signal that I no longer belonged in the habitat of the living. And the bus driver, who has always waited an extra breath when he sees me coming, closed the doors with an apologetic shrug because a policy had changed about elder boarding without escorts. And the cashier at the market asked for my date of birth with the kind of cheerful pity usually reserved for children counting pennies. And at the bank, the teller I like was replaced by a man who spoke without verbs and asked whether I had considered adding a trusted contact to my account. And when I said I trusted myself, he handed me a pamphlet that reviewed signs of financial confusion. And I walked home under a sky so cloudless it felt like a lid, and I found that someone had flipped my nameplate on the mailbox so it read "Estate of" before my name, the O of estate drawn with a flourish, as if to reassure me that extinction could be elegant. And when I said it right again, I noticed that the faint ghost of the cross still rose from the wood whenever the light grew thin and the air damp. And I scrubbed the door once more and found, as women often do, that erasing one insult invites another, because the next morning a sympathy card without a return address lay on the mat, the kind with a pre-printed message about release and the quiet of the river, and inside a single line in neat block letters: "It's time to let go." It would be a lie to say that none of this entered me, that I did not go to bed with the paperwork stacked like a small tower beside the lamp and wake to the tower's shadow sliding across the quilt as the sun turned the room, because repetition is a kind of infrastructure for harm. And when the same message arrives by different messengers, a person can begin to mistake the echo for truth. And there were moments in the long afternoons when the house hummed too loudly and the clock pushed its minutes across the face like furniture. And I heard in my own chest the first frail questions we ask when the world insists that we have become an inconvenience. And I wondered whether perhaps there would be relief in surrender, whether the neat hallway and the well-lit dining room and the orderly schedule might hold the anxiety still the way a paperweight holds a scattering of pages. And then I would pour tea and think of my husband's hands, which never rushed me and never treated me as a problem to be solved. And I would stand at the sink with the steam on my face and say out loud, because sometimes the ear needs to hear the mouth to believe the mind, that I am not done, and that love is not the same as management, and that concern without respect is only fear in a tidy dress. So the first escalation did not come like an argument I could answer. It came as 100 nudges meant to tip me from my balance until I no longer recognized the particular steadiness of my own feet. And to this I responded with small, almost invisible acts that would have looked like nothing if you were standing at your window tallying my decline, because I began to keep a ledger on yellow paper, where I recorded each knock, each call, each absence disguised as assistance, and I tucked the deed into a place where my hand could find it in the dark, and I made copies of the important documents and slid them into the insides of cookbooks no one but me would open, and I placed a clean envelope with a little cash beneath the drawer liner, because a woman who has survived other kinds of scarcity knows that contingency is not paranoia. And when the wellness assessment team telephoned to confirm their arrival, I asked for their first and last names and the statute that authorized them and the criteria by which they would judge whether the kitchen where I had cooked for decades could still be corrected by my hands. And there was a very long pause before a voice told me that I sounded prepared, and I said, "I am, because I have been being prepared for a very long time without knowing that was what I was doing." And when I hung up the phone and sat in the armchair by the window, I could feel the slow swell of something that was not anger and not grief, but the muscular. Beginning of refusal stretching itself awake in an old body that still understands how to stand. I remember the first morning when the weight in my chest loosened, not because the world had grown gentler, but because I had chosen to stop bending. I woke up in that narrow, rented room, sunlight leaking through a curtain so thin it could hardly keep its promise of privacy, and for the first time in years, I did not feel like a trespasser in my own day. The room was small, no more than a bed, a dresser with drawers that protested every pull, and a crooked chair pushed against the wall, yet it felt more mine than the house where I had been dismissed. More mine than the kitchen where every casserole became another debt, more mine than the guest rooms dressed like cages with polite linens. It was mine because I had paid for it with my own hand, in bills folded from wages I had earned standing on tired feet behind a counter, pouring coffee for strangers who did not ask me to be less. Joyce, with her raspy voice and unadorned honesty, had given me the key with a shrug, saying she didn't mind another woman rattling around upstairs so long as I didn't burn the place down. Her house smelled of onions fried too hot and lavender dried too long, and her cat prowled like a disinterested landlord. But in her quiet way, she had offered me shelter without conditions. She didn't ask for my story, didn't ask me to explain who had left me or why, didn't even ask my last name until she needed it for the rent slip. That absence of curiosity was a gift, an acknowledgement that I was allowed to exist without justification. The cafe job came next, almost by accident. A chalkboard sign with the words "Help Wanted" scratched in crooked letters. I could have walked past, could have told myself I was too old, too stiff, too accustomed to being looked through. But something in me refused. I stepped inside, inhaled the bitter comfort of burnt toast and overboiled coffee, and said I wanted to work. Heather, the manager, looked me over with the weary suspicion of someone who has heard too many promises. But when I told her I had raised 3 children, buried a husband, and never missed a morning shift in 40 years of life, she gave me a trial day. That first shift was brutal, my hands clumsy with the rhythm, my back singing with pain. But by the second hour, I found my pace. I remembered how to move among demands without apology. By the end, Heather gave me a curt nod and handed me an apron, and that apron became more than cloth. It was a declaration that I still had currency in this world beyond memory and obligation. When the first paycheck arrived, small and modest, I cashed it with deliberate pride. The bills folded into my wallet carried a sweetness no larger sum had ever given me, because these were not allowances from a son's guilty conscience or scraps of holiday help pressed into my hand like tips. This was mine, earned by me, belonging only to me. I walked out of the bank and into a second-hand shop and bought myself a coat. Navy wool with a subtle pattern, the kind of garment that feels like it remembers how to hold dignity. I wore it out of the store, the fabric heavy across my shoulders, and for the first time in years, when I caught my reflection in a shop window, I did not look like someone waiting to be dismissed. I looked like a woman walking forward. Life began to form a rhythm. Mornings at the cafe, afternoons of walking streets that did not know my name, evenings spent at Joyce's table where meals were simple and conversation optional. The quiet was not emptiness, it was space. Into that space crept small joys I had forgotten how to notice. The way warm bread softens even the hardest day, the sound of a cat stretching against the radiator, the relief of counting coins at the end of a shift and realizing they are yours. Alone, I did not need grand gestures. I needed the ordinary to belong to me again. Arthur began appearing at the cafe, an older man with a limp disguised by careful pride, ordering coffee with 2 splashes of cream. He didn't pry, didn't press, just lingered at the counter with the calm patience of someone who knows that companionship often begins with silence. We talked of birds, of weather, of nothing urgent, and that nothing was a balm. When he placed a photograph of his late wife on the counter one morning, saying she had made better coffee but would have liked me, I felt a flicker of belonging that did not demand a price. The turning point was not a thunderclap. It was the slow realization that I had begun to inhabit my own skin again, that each step to work was no longer a march of survival, but a claim of presence. Evenings, I would hang the navy coat on the back of my door, smooth the fabric, and tell myself without speaking it aloud, "You are still here. You are still whole. You are no longer waiting to be invited back into a life that discarded you." It was in that stillness that I dared to turn on the phone again, the one I had kept wrapped in a handkerchief like a relic too dangerous to touch. The screen lit with dozens of missed calls, messages dripping with fabricated worry, demands disguised as love. I scrolled without answering until I found one voice that did not cut. My grandson, Kieran. His words were plain, not rehearsed, not staged. "I miss you. Please let me know you're okay." That letter, that message, that simple truth reached me deeper than all the others. I did not call back immediately. I wasn't ready to let the old world back into the new one I had begun to build. But I folded his letter carefully into the nightstand beside my bed, and I told myself that when I was strong enough, I would let that one thread remain, because it was spun from something real. The midpoint of my story was not freedom fully claimed, but freedom glimpsed. It was the first steady paycheck, the first coat chosen without permission, the first morning when I stood in a crowded cafe and poured coffee into a stranger's cup without feeling invisible. It was the quiet refusal to disappear, the decision to answer the world not with rage or apology, but with simple, stubborn continuation. They had painted a cross on my door to declare me finished. But here, in a rented room with sunlight creeping through thin curtains, I knew I had only just begun. The pressure did not thunder back in all at once. It returned like a tide that forgets nothing, creeping over thresholds it had already crossed, leaving a salt line higher on the walls. And I understood that the midpoint, my small decision to stop bending, had not ended anything. It had merely announced me to the people who preferred I arrive only as a memory. The Tuesday wellness assessment did not knock so much as stage an entrance. A woman with a clipboard whose smile was as tight as a bandage, a younger man with an eager pen, and, though the letter had not promised it, a uniformed officer who stood on my porch with the expression of someone trying to remember which chapter covered widows with tidy gardens. I had set the kettle to sing, laid out the yellow ledger with my neat black entries, propped my reading glasses on the bridge of my nose, the way my husband used to say, made me look like trouble, and opened the door as if greeting guests I had actually invited. They wanted to see the kitchen. I showed them the pantry first, each jar labeled, each tin stacked. They wanted to see the bathroom. I flicked the light and watched their eyes move, not to the rails I had installed years ago, but to the mirror. Perhaps hoping it might reflect chaos, the officer asked, too casually, whether I ever got confused about the stove, and I reached over and turned the knob until the flame whispered to life, and then off again, steady, ordinary, mine. Clipboard asked about my medications. I set the bottles on the counter and read the names aloud without hurry, then told them the pharmacy had attempted a transfer to a facility I had not chosen, and handed them the note where I had recorded the date, the time, and the name of the man who had apologized to me for a mistake he had not made. When the young man asked whether I had support systems, I poured tea for all four of us and answered that I had a spine, 2 neighbors I still trusted, and a pastor I listened to less often than he would prefer. I did not mention the boy across the street who had started leaving small bundles of mint on my stoop with a scribbled note that said, "From Grandma's garden," because some protections are stronger when unnamed. They poked, they peered, they wrote. Through the lace of my curtains, I could see Mrs. Penfield arranged at her window like a saint in a stained glass panel, performing concern with those pursed lips that look like a tidy scar. When Clipboard Woman finally said, "We'll be in touch," I asked her for her surname, the statute authorizing unannounced visits, and the criteria by which I would be measured unfit to boil water in the house I had scrubbed with my own aching hands. And she blinked, because no one likes to be reminded that authority is not the same as permission. As they stepped off the porch, the officer paused and asked, quietly, almost kindly, whether I had family nearby. And I told him I had a daughter a few towns over and a garden exactly here. And if both insisted on rearranging me, well, that was a conversation for another day. He nodded, the way tired men do when they recognize that a boundary is older than their badge. By Thursday, the pharmacy made good on its threat and refused to refill unless Glen Oaks assumed oversight. So I walked there myself with my cane and my coat and my ledger, and I placed the bottle on the counter and informed Mr. Hollis that I would not be transferred like a file to a new drawer. He looked genuinely sorry and said the system would not allow it, and I said the system would have to speak to my lawyer, and I wrote down his apology because sometimes pen and paper are the only leverage left to a woman who is supposed to be grateful. On Friday morning, a funeral wreath appeared on my stoop, white lilies bound by a satin ribbon that read, "In loving memory," as if my house had become a mausoleum overnight. I lifted it carefully, as if it might drip poison, and crossed the street and placed it on Mrs. Penfield's steps with the gentleness of someone leaving a casserole. And when she came out to retrieve it, her pearl ear baubles quivering like guilty bells, I held her gaze long enough for her to remember the winter I brought her soup, when she could not leave her bed. She flinched and said it must be a prank, and I said yes, the way painting a cross is a prayer, and left her to wonder whether the neighborhood was still watching. Saturday night the cross returned, larger, quicker, a furious X that bit into the wood like a verdict. This time I did not fetch water. I fetched the can of red paint I had bought out of stubbornness, and something older, and I drew a circle over the white, a round, unbroken ring that swallowed the slash and said what my mouth had not. This threshold belongs to me. My hand shook once, then steadied, and by the time I set the brush down, the door looked like it had grown an eye. From the corner of the hedge, the boy with the mint, Eli, I had learned, though he prefers I call him Lee, stepped out with a bucket he had filled at home, and without a word he rinsed the steps so the red drops wouldn't stain the winter wood, and I felt the oddest swell of gratitude toward a child who understood that sometimes the most radical thing is to hold the ladder while someone older climbs. He told me he had seen 2 figures in hooded sweatshirts move quick and bent, and that one of them laughed, a high, thin sound like a whistle, and that he thought he recognized the shoes, and I wrote it all down, not because I wanted to be a detective, but because paper remembers what nerves forget. Sunday at church. Father O'Connell spoke about protection, the kind that looks like control and the kind that looks like love. And afterward he squeezed my hands too long and told me the prayer chain had my name on it, And I told him, prayer is strong, but signatures on letters are stronger, and he winced because priests prefer incense to affidavits. In the bulletin, I found my own name under those approaching transition, and I took a pen from my purse and drew a line through it, and wrote beside it in tidy print, "Not yet." And I left the bulletin on the pew for others to find because small graffiti is its own liturgy. Monday morning, my daughter Ruth arrived unannounced, as full of the efficiency of a woman who believes she is saving a life as she has always been empty, of the tenderness of someone who might remember whose life she is rearranging. She did not come alone. She brought a man who introduced himself as a care coordinator, a phrase so bloodless it could be used to categorize cattle. And they stood in my kitchen and looked around like realtors, while Ruth explained that she had moved my name to the top of a waiting list, that Glen Oaks had a room available if we acted swiftly, that my stubbornness was hurting everyone, and that she had already paid a non-refundable deposit, which, she added brightly, we can consider a lost cost of love. I asked her whether love was taxable this year, and she did not laugh. She said this wasn't a joke, and I said it wasn't an auction either. And then she took a deep breath, the one she uses before delivering a closing argument to people who have no lawyer, and said she had consulted with someone about temporary guardianship because things were escalating. I asked whether the painting of a circle qualified as dangerous escalation, and she said, my door now looked like a target, and I told her it looked like a boundary that had finally learned to speak. The care coordinator, a man with an apologetic tie and the kind of voice you use with frightened dogs, asked if he could take a quick look around for safety. And I told him he could look from where he stood, because the last time someone walked through my rooms with that air, I ended up with a wreath instead of milk. He tried a different tack, complimented my garden, admired my ledger, told me his own grandmother had resisted help until it was too late. And then he said the sentence that told me he had no idea who I was. You'll be so relieved once the decisions are out of your hands. My hands, which have cooked for funerals and births, and the empty middle days which have cleaned other people's kitchens at midnight and held babies who could not sleep, which have fixed lamps and mended hems and pulled weeds, so stubborn they squealed, shook not with fear but with insult. And I told him very calmly that I had made decisions in rooms with louder men than he would ever be, and I would go on making them until it was finished. He smiled, because his training had not prepared him for contempt without raised voices, and he suggested we revisit the conversation later in the week. Ruth stood by the sink, looking as if she had misplaced her keys in a fire, and before she left, she put her cool palm on my cheek and said she loved me, and I said I knew, and that love without respect is a leash, and she let her hand fall as if it had become heavy. They were not finished. That afternoon, a man from the gas company arrived saying there had been a report of a leak and he needed to check the lines. I asked if he had a work order, and he did not, only a name on a clip-on badge, and I told him the stove, and I had already performed for an audience this week, and we were done. The next morning, a white van idled at my curb for 40 minutes, plain, patient, pretending to rest. I wrote down the plates and taped the paper inside my cupboard door. A notice appeared on the community board outside the church, asking for volunteers to deliver meals to a house in crisis, and I took the paper down and placed it in Father's hands, and suggested that next time he use names or none, because anonymity is the always polished spoon of gossip. On Wednesday, the mailbox held a letter with a county seal, an appointment for an evaluation of decision-making capacity, 4 syllables to cover the theft of a woman's ordinary choices, and it was signed by someone whose title was 3 lines long, and whose name I had never heard. I telephoned legal aid and listened to hold music that pretended to be soothing, and finally spoke to a young woman whose voice had both caffeine and compassion. And she told me to keep the appointment, but not my temper, to answer questions with facts, and not with the history of how those facts had been weaponized, and she gave me a list of things to bring: medications, bills paid, a list of people I trusted enough to call by first name, and the name of a doctor not controlled by Glen Oaks. While I gathered papers, the cross bloomed again, this time not on the door but on the mailbox, a brisk slash that made the red of my door look like a mouth. I took a photograph before I washed it off, because there are times when evidence is more nourishing than fury, and as I scrubbed, I felt the sting that has become familiar lately, the small tears opening in my palms where the skin is thin, the ache that announces consequences, and I said aloud to the empty street that I was not afraid, and the words surprised me by sounding true. Lee emerged again, not with mint this time, but with a small handheld camera, and he asked if I wanted it set to record at night, and I said yes, though I did not want to live beneath a watchful lens. And as he adjusted settings on my porch, I thought, of all the ways children learn to be citizens when adults teach them how to hide. The capacity evaluation took place in a room that smelled like dry books and disinfectant, and the woman who conducted it wore soft shoes and a cardigan with daisies that made her look like a kindergarten teacher at a funeral. She asked me to remember 3 words and then spoke for 10 minutes and asked me to repeat them. I did, because I am not yet Ash, and she asked me to draw a clock face and set the hands to 10 past 11, and I did, because I have been watching. Clocks steal mornings for 80 years, and I know what they look like. And she asked how I would respond to a fire, and I told her I would put it out unless it was in someone else's house, and then I let myself say what I had rehearsed. That a dozen small acts had been arranged to make my competence wobble: a wreath, a van, a transferred prescription, a counsel with a clipboard, and that I have been the steward of this house longer than any of their systems, and the only thing that had changed was other people's patience. She looked at me then not like a subject but like a story, and she said, in a voice that was less professional than it was human, that sometimes the problem is not capacity, but consent, and I understood that there are officials who still take off their shoes before they walk into a life. They left me alone for 2 days, as if regrouping, and then the article arrived. A pink-cheeked photograph of me from a church picnic 5 summers ago, the headline announcing a community concern for isolated elder, quotes from Ruth about my stubborn bravery, a line from Mrs. Penfield about how it takes a village to keep people safe, and a final paragraph with a phone number to report sightings, as if I were a coyote near a schoolyard. I spread the newspaper on my kitchen table and smoothed the creases with the same hands that have always refused to need anyone's pity. And I laughed once at the way concern becomes etiquette for cruelty. That evening, while I watered the roses at dusk, a car rolled past slowly, windows down, and a man's voice, too young to own such certainty, called out, "We're praying for you." And I said thank you because my mother taught me to say thank you even when I am closing the door behind someone. It might have broken me then, the accumulation, the relentless choreography of nudges and notices, if not for the small counterweights that kept finding places to stand. A woman from 3 doors down, whom I had known only as the owner of a loud dog with a sweet face, stopped with her leash wrapped around her wrist, and asked if I wanted her phone number in case of anything after dark. And she added that she had seen 2 teens in hoodies near my stoop, and that the laughter had not sounded brave. And I wrote that down too. Father O'Connell, who is at his best when he stops being a priest and remembers he is a person, came by with a loaf of bread he did not bless and said he had removed my name from any lists that guessed at my expiration. And he asked if he could keep the bulletin I had edited because he found the words not yet better than half his homilies. Mr. Hollis from the pharmacy telephoned, not to tell me he had accomplished a miracle he could not, but to say that he had filed a complaint about the forced transfer, and that if I desired, he would hand me all my records in person. And I said yes, because possession can be a sacrament. Of course, Ruth returned. Pressure is patient. She came with a folder labeled Next Steps, and the same brittle tiredness that defines women who believe they are the only grown-up at the party. She asked to walk through the house and point out tripping hazards, and I told her my hazards were mostly seated behind steering wheels. She asked if we could go through my closet to choose a week's worth of practical clothing for the move, and I asked whether Glen Oaks banned silk scarves, and she said this wasn't funny, and I said neither is theft. She cried then, in the practiced quiet that avoids smudging mascara, and I wanted to touch her hair the way I did when she was 5 and tangled, but I did not. She told me she had always been the one to hold the line for the family, and I told her I had been the line. She said the house was too much for me. I said I had already managed the worst part, which was other people's plans. She put the folder on the table and left without kissing me, and later I opened it and read the words petition and temporary and capacity, and felt a fear that was not for myself, but for the version of me they were trying to invent. That night, after midnight, the camera Lee had set up blinked awake and recorded 2 thin figures approaching the door, one of them carrying a can and the other holding a phone for light. The video captured the hiss of the spray paint, the slash of the new cross, the whispered giggle, and one clear sentence: "Do it quick. She's old." And I watched it in the morning with my coffee and felt something inside me slide into place, the way a latch catches a gate. I called the officer who had stood on my porch with his careful eyes and told him I had something to show him. And when he arrived, I did not pretend surprise when he recognized one of them, because there are boys who become men before their mothers are ready, and there are boys who do not grow up until someone older refuses to duck. He took the video and the still images and asked if I wanted to press charges, and I said I wanted a conversation first, not because I am saintly, but because punishment without understanding turns children into more careful cowards. He arranged it in the police station lobby, a place with chairs too hard for comfort, and the 2 came with their hair too clean and their apologies rehearsed, and I explained to them slowly the difference between a prank and an erasure, between laughter and a push toward a cliff. And then I asked them to scrub the door themselves while I watched, and to write with their own hands that they had trespassed on a life, and to deliver the note to Father O'Connell for the bulletin, not because I wanted public pity, but because I wanted the neighborhood to stop pretending it did not know itself. They scrubbed until their wrists ached, and the white faded, and the red ring remained. And when they handed me the rag, the younger asked if he could fix the hinge on my gate. And I nodded, because apology is most honest when it has to find a screwdriver. The escalation did not stop. Those who prefer tidy removal rarely surrender. The Improvement Council sent another letter proposing a temporary relocation to facilitate necessary renovations. A phrase so delicate it could lull a person into signing her home away. And I wrote back a sentence that said, "No renovations will be undertaken without my request, my presence, and my signature," and I mailed it certified because some words deserve a receipt. A developer I had never met left a glossy brochure in my box, promising to maximize property value while honoring legacy. And I returned it with 2 words in black marker: Legacy Lives. And that night, I slept without waking to listen for footsteps, because exhaustion sometimes chooses you like mercy. The article spawned 3 casseroles on my stoop and 1 jar of soup with a label that said, "Bone broth for strength." And I ate the soup because bones do love broth, and left the casseroles on the porch swing for the raccoons, who also deserve to benefit from the performative kindness of strangers. There was one more turn, the kind that splits a day in half. A letter arrived from the county. Not an appointment this time, but a notice that due to multiple community concerns, Adult Protective Services would be petitioning for authority to conduct a more comprehensive evaluation with potential emergency placement. The date was set. The petition had Ruth's name and a cluster of signatures beneath the bland printed lines. I read it twice, then put the kettle on, then read it again, then felt the room tilt, and I sat down because even steel must be bolted to something. I telephoned legal aid, and this time asked not for a waiting room voice but for names. And within an hour, I had an appointment with a woman whose emails used fewer adjectives than mine. I gathered my deed, my receipts, my bills in order, my ledger, the video, the bulletin with "not yet," and the letter from Mr. Hollis. I added a photograph of the red circle doorway because my brain told me it was unprofessional, and my heart told me it was necessary. When I met the lawyer, small, direct, wearing shoes built for walking uphill, she listened without interrupting, then said that people often confound loneliness with incompetence and impatience with danger. She promised a letter that would say in a register, "The county respects what I had been saying. In the register, the neighborhood ignores." And she asked me the only question that mattered. "What do you want?" I told her I wanted my house, my mourning, and my name. And she said those were reasonable demands given the evidence, and her pen scratched a sound that was almost soothing. That evening, with the letter already in my inbox, I carried a chair onto the porch and sat in the orange light, as if keeping watch over my own life. The red ring around the door had dried to a dull calm. Across the street, curtains shifted and stilled. Somewhere a radio flickered through a ball game, and farther off a dog barked as if reciting a poem. Lee wandered over, hands jammed in hoodie pockets, and leaned on the railing and told me the boys who had painted the last cross had told others they were ashamed, that they'd been egged on by someone older whose brother worked for a company that bought houses cheap from complicated situations. I nodded, not surprised, only newly unwilling to call the machine by a softer name. A breeze moved through the hedges and carried the faint smell of soap from my freshly scrubbed steps. I felt tired, but the clean kind of tired that follows work with meaning, and as the sky lost its colors, I understood the shape of the test. They were going to keep pressing until I either surrendered or built something they could not knock down. With forms, I had my ledger, my letters, my ring of red paint, my spine, my lawyer, my priest when he remembered to be human, my pharmacist's small rebellion, a boy with a camera, and my own voice, which had stopped asking permission. This was not yet the end. It was the pressure before the hinge gives, the held breath before the door opens, either in or out. I would sleep. I would lay my hands flat upon the blankets to remind them that they had not been emptied. And in the morning, I would begin to choose my weapon, not a blade or a curse, but the blunt, patient weight of a woman who refuses to be edited out of her own life. It is one thing to resist in silence, to fold letters away and answer voicemails with absence, and another thing entirely to place your refusal into the world in a form that cannot be softened or revised. I had endured the wreaths, the petitions, the legal notices, even Lisa's trembling imitation of remorse. But the day I sat at Joyce's table and signed my name at the bottom of a letter drafted by my own hand, I understood that I was closing not just a door but an entire corridor of my life. The pen moved steadily, black ink on white paper, a line so clean it startled me. I am of sound mind. I live where I choose. Any further attempt to interfere will be treated as harassment. It did not sound like the voice of a grandmother or a widow or a frail dependent. It sounded like the woman I had once been before decades of compromise dulled the blade, direct, precise, unwilling to beg. I mailed it myself, walking down the cracked sidewalk in my navy coat, the deed folded into the lining of my purse like an amulet. At the post office counter, the clerk glanced at the recipient, Derek Sorensen, attorney at law, and then at me. And for a moment, I thought she might ask what business an old woman had with a man whose title stretched across half an envelope. But she only stamped it, slid it into the bin, and nodded. A gesture so ordinary, yet it carried the weight of a declaration. When I stepped back outside, the air was brisk, the sky low, and for the first time in years, I felt no compulsion to look over my shoulder. That night I wrote a second letter, this one shorter, stripped of ceremony. It was for Lisa. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I finally started mine. I folded it, sealed it, pressed the stamp down firmly as if securing a wound, and set it beside the first. It was not vengeance. It was a cut, clean and irreversible. I had been dangling from a rope braided by their pity, their need, their manipulation, and now I had severed it myself. When the letters were gone, the house felt lighter, as though the walls had unclenched. Joyce looked at me across the kitchen, her cigarette smoldering in a chipped ashtray, and said, "You've got that look again." I asked what look. The one that says you're not waiting to be forgiven anymore. She poured us both cheap wine into coffee mugs, and we toasted not to family or reconciliation or survival, but to the simple act of staying put. The following morning, Arthur shuffled into the cafe at his usual hour, leaning heavier on his cane than before. I poured his coffee, 2 splashes of cream, and he studied my face with the unhurried curiosity of a man who has stopped chasing time. "You look lighter," he said. I told him I had written my last letter. He didn't ask to whom, didn't press for details, only nodded and said, "Sometimes the letters you don't expect to send are the ones that save you." That afternoon, when the sun dropped behind the row houses and the street lamps hummed awake, I stood on Joyce's porch and breathed in the damp metallic air. No vans idled at the curb, no wreaths waited on the step, no cross marred the door. Instead, there was only Franklin the cat slinking along the railing and the faint sound of a child's laugh drifting from the house across the street. The silence was no longer an accusation, it was space. I understood then that my climax had not come with shouting or courtroom battles or slammed doors, but with ink drying on paper. with the sound of envelopes slipping into a bin, with the quiet certainty that I had spoken in a register no one could mistake. I was not angry anymore. Anger requires a tether, and mine had been cut. What remained was something harder, calmer, like stone that has endured 1,000 storms and still refuses to crumble. I was finished negotiating the terms of my own existence. I had chosen, I had declared, and now I would live the life that remained without permission. And so the climax was not spectacle but decision, not fire but steel. It was the moment an old woman wrote her own name with steady hand and meant every curve of the letters. It was the act of saying not please, but enough. And in that act, I felt not just relief, but a strange, unexpected triumph. They had painted a cross on my door to mark me for disappearance, but it was I who had written the final mark, sharp and permanent, across the ledger of our history. The house is quiet now, but not with the suffocating silence that once pressed against my ears like a warning, more with the stillness of a room after laughter, when the air remembers the sound, even after the voices have gone. I sit at the small wooden table Joyce gave me when I first moved in, its surface scarred with burns and knife marks, and I let the steam from the teacup rise around my face. The letters are gone, mailed and done, my words traveling in envelopes I will never see again. But their weight has left me, and I feel as though I have set down a trunk I carried too long on a back that bent from habit. Nothing in the world outside looks different. The buses still grind their way down Main Street. The children still leave chalk drawings on the sidewalk. The pigeons still scatter and return in their ridiculous choreography. But inside me there is a change so quiet I almost miss it. I am no longer waiting for the next knock, the next letter, the next painted mark. Whatever comes now, it will find me not as a supplicant, but as myself, and that makes all the difference. Sometimes I catch myself imagining what they are saying about me in that old neighborhood, whether Mrs. Penfield clucks her tongue and announces I have finally given in, or whether Ruth tells her colleagues that her mother is being looked after at last, or whether the younger ones whisper that I vanished into the same shadow they one day will. I used to want to correct them, to stand in the middle of the street and shout that I am not finished, that my lungs still fill with breath, and my legs still carry me where I choose, that my mind still sharpens itself each morning like a blade across stone. Now I realize their stories are their own consolation, and they may keep them if they must. My truth does not require their approval. My truth sits here in the navy coat hanging by the door, in the paycheck folded into the old wallet, in the circle I painted red over white, in the teacup that warms my hands. In the evenings, I walk to the small park at the edge of town, where a single wooden bench leans slightly to one side, and I sit among the sparrows that scold and argue in the trees. Sometimes Arthur joins me, his cane tapping against the path, and we share a silence that is not empty, but companionable. He talks about his wife when he feels strong enough, and I tell him stories of the market or the cafe, and neither of us pretends that we are young or that life has been merciful, but we honor the stubbornness of being here still. On those walks home, when the street lamps flicker awake and the air smells faintly of wood smoke, I find myself smiling at nothing in particular, simply at the fact that I am still able to place one foot before the other and call it living. I know the battles are not gone forever. Bureaucracy is a patient enemy, and families, even when they mean well, often confuse possession with love. There will be more papers, perhaps, more suggestions disguised as kindness, more cautious smiles that ask me to surrender quietly. But I have crossed a threshold inside myself that cannot be uncrossed, Once you have written your own refusal in ink and sent it into the world, once you have declared yourself alive on your own terms, no force can return you entirely to silence. They may knock, they may circle, they may whisper, but they cannot unmake what has been spoken. At night, before I turn off the lamp, I sometimes think of other women, faces I have seen in church pews, in grocery aisles, behind cafe counters, women whose shoulders slope from carrying years of being told they are fragile, inconvenient, replaceable. I think of the way they nod when others speak over them, the way they lower their voices so as not to startle anyone with their needs, the way they carry their griefs in silence because the world does not want to hear them. I want to reach them somehow, to sit across a small table and pour them tea and tell them what I have learned, that the cross painted on the door is only paint, that silence is not safety, that dignity does not arrive as a gift but must be claimed, that even at 82 the word enough can still ring like a bell. So if there is another woman listening, one who feels the slow erasure of her presence, one who has been told in too many small ways that her end is near, I would tell her this: do not wait for them to hand back what they have already taken. Do not let their pity draft the story of your life. Wash the cross off your door, paint your own mark, however crooked, however trembling, and let them see that you are not afraid to be visible. Live in the space you choose, wear the coat you have earned, drink tea from your own cup, and let the world adjust itself to your persistence. As for me, I will sit here a little longer, letting the steam rise, listening to the clock tick without dread. The night gathers itself outside the window, the cat shifts on the radiator, and my hands, though lined and thin, still feel steady enough to lift the cup. I am not waiting for an end anymore. I am inhabiting the middle, the fierce, ordinary middle, and it is enough.